All right, guys, we're going to start the video here on our third lecture of Unit 6, the heart. So we kind of took a detour on our last lecture away from the cardiovascular system. We talked about the lymphatic system, as you guys know. We're jumping back into the cardiovascular system. Remember, we talked about the three components that make up the cardiovascular system. We've already talked about the blood, and the heart obviously is in this lecture, and then our last lecture will be the next lecture, which will be on blood vessels. Okay. We're going to spend an entire lecture here, even though it's a fairly short lecture, only 9 slides, detailing just one organ. In my opinion, probably the coolest organ that we have. Pretty amazing organ, one that we cannot survive without. Many of them are that way, obviously, but nonetheless, super, super important. Okay. Think of your heart basically just like a muscle. In fact, we've talked about this since the beginning of the semester when we first learned about muscle, that there were 3 types. We learned that there was skeletal muscle, which is what we talked about earlier in the semester, like your biceps brachii and your triceps and pec majors and those things. And we learned about, and we talked a little bit about smooth muscle, and we'll continue to talk more about smooth muscle in places like your blood vessels and that kind of stuff. And then cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is what makes up the majority of our heart. And we can describe our heart as that main muscle responsible for pumping what we call deoxygenated blood to our lungs and oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. Some pretty cool statistics here in this first paragraph. I'll read through. It must beat constantly to circulate blood through the body's blood vessels so it can reach our body cells and exchange materials with them. And to accomplish this, our heart must beat about 100,000 times a day, which adds up to about 35 million beats per year, 2.5 billion beats in a lifetime. Incredible, incredible organ. And if you want to think of it as about the size of your fist, take your fist, close it up, that's about the size of your heart. Okay, about 12 centimeters or 5 inches in length, and it's longest top to bottom. 9 centimeters or 3.5 inches wide at its broadest point, and 6 centimeters or 2.5 inches thick. Weighs about 8 ounces in females and 10 ounces in men. Its location is in the mediastinum. We've learned about this region before, back actually in our first lecture of the semester. This is an anatomical region that extends from our sternum, anteriorly, posteriorly to the vertebral column, and then it's located between the first rib and between the lungs. Okay. There's something we talked about in our very first lecture, and that was when we learned about the terms base and apex, which refers to the fact that our heart, like many other organs, our lungs being one of them, are a triangular shape, okay, where there's a wide point, okay, or a wide side, and then a point, okay. Now, unlike most triangles, which the point or apex is typically pointing upwards, the heart is inverted, okay, which means that the apex points downward. Okay, whereas the base, it is going to be on top. Okay, we can describe the apex as formed by the tip of the left ventricle, and it rests on top of that diaphragm muscle that we learned about way back at many points in the semester, all the way back to even our first lecture. Okay. Base is on its posterior, or is a posterior surface, and is formed by the upper chambers of the heart, what we call the atrium. And now, unlike your lungs, which point upwards and pretty much are a nice triangle sitting normally, okay, our heart, so I'm just going to use my hand here, is a triangle that does not sit normally. It's kind of cockeyed, okay, and so we can kind of see that here. The point of your heart points down towards your left hip, and the base points more up towards where your right shoulder would be. And now on top of that, your heart actually also sits from front to back like this. So it's not straight up and down, but it points forward at the bottom, okay? And the base actually is not visible here because it's pointed towards the back of our body. Okay? And that's why it says it's the posterior surface. Okay? Now there's an anterior surface, which would be just all of this. It's deep to the sternum and ribs. The inferior surface is between the apex and what we call the right border. Should be what this portion is. It rests on our diaphragm. And then the right surface or border faces the right lung, extends from the inferior surface to the base, and then the left surface or left border faces our left lung, extends from the base to the apex. So that's just kind of giving you an idea of the way that the heart is oriented in our chest. Here's kind of another illustration to show you that with the midclavicular, or excuse me, the midline, and then the midclavicular line over here on the left side, right over there by the nipple, is where that apex is pointing. And that's why, you know, when you do the Pledge of Allegiance or Star Spangled Banner, you put your hand over your chest. You don't do it right down the middle. You put it off to the left a little bit more than the right, because that's where most of your heart actually rests. And that's pretty same illustration over here on the left side of the page. Okay, hang on one second, guys. I gotta pause. Sorry about that. As usual, trying to deal with kids and record videos. Okay, let's talk about the heart wall and the sac that surrounds the heart. What we call the pericardium is the sac. It's a loose, fitting, inextensible sac that protects and encloses the heart. Actually, not the first time we've learned about this organ, or this structure, I guess. Back in that very first lecture of the semester, when we discussed viscera, organs of the abdominal and pelvic and thoracic cavities, we learned that there were kind of three major membranes: pericardium, pleura, peritoneum. And we're going to be talking about those three here in the next couple weeks, in the next couple lectures. Pericardium is the first of those to be discussed. At that time, we learned that each of those three structures actually was a two-part double membrane. In this case, we have what's called a fibrous pericardium and a serous pericardium. Fibrous pericardium is the outer layer, and it is a tough, inelastic, meaning it doesn't stretch, dense, irregular connective tissue. So it's got a lot of collagen fibers. Those collagen fibers are running in all different directions, and it basically prevents the heart from just kind of ballooning up too much. Okay? Covers the entire heart, but only forms attachment at what we call the greater vessels, which are what extend out of the top of the heart, like this aorta and superior vena cava, pulmonary trunk, etc. Okay. Function of it is to anchor the heart to surrounding structures, and as I mentioned, prevent it from overstretching. The more inner, more delicate membrane is called the serous pericardium, and it's actually a double layer in itself. Okay. The two layers of it were the parietal and visceral layers. Okay. The parietal layer is the outermost, and it is fused to the fibrous pericardium. Okay, so here, if we look at the bottom, we're looking at just a small section of the heart and the wall, and the pericardium and the heart wall, I should say. On the outside, very thick layer is that fibrous pericardium. And if I zoom in, you can see this kind of white line right in here. That arrow, right, excuse me, is pointing to that parietal layer of the serous pericardium. Okay. Notice next, there's a blue line. That blue line is actually a space called the pericardial cavity that separates the parietal layer from the visceral layer. Okay, so the visceral layer, which is also known as the epicardium, is the inner layer. Actually, is one of the layers of the heart wall. And it adheres tightly to the surface of the heart, and that's why it's part of the heart wall. Okay, that space I mentioned called the pericardial space or pericardial cavity, and it contains pericardial fluid, which is a thick layer of serous fluid. And it's a lubricant. It prevents, you know, friction. You know, as those heart wall layer, those sac layers rub against each other, they need a slippery surface. Otherwise, you know, friction can create holes. That's not a good thing. Okay. Infections and inflammation actually can cause friction in the pericardial surfaces, resulting in very severe pain. You ever heard the term pericarditis? That refers to pericardial inflammation. You can get space in that pericardial space. It's called pericardial tamponade. It requires surgery to relieve the pressure. It could be very dangerous, very painful, obviously, as I mentioned, not something anybody would ever want to experience. Okay. Now, I've already talked about one of the three layers of the heart, okay, the heart wall, I should say, and that's the epicardium. There's also a myocardium and an endocardium. The epicardium is the outer part, also known as the serous pericardium, composed of mesothelium, which is a type of epithelial tissue, and delicate connective tissue, imparting a smooth, slippery texture to the outermost surface of the heart. The myocardium, if you remember back when we first talked about muscle, we learned that the prefix myo refers to muscle, is the thick contractile middle layer of the heart. That's what this red layer is, showing you very thick, by far and away the thickest part of the heart wall. That's the cardiac muscle, as you can see here in parentheses. And now those muscle fibers run in a specific pattern, just like the muscle fibers in our skeletal muscle ran. We talked about that earlier in the semester. Okay, and they run and create kind of swirled layers, which is what this illustration is showing you. These lines represent the direction in which those fibers run, which is pretty cool. But it's important, and just like with our skeletal muscle, they run in a specific pattern, in this case to squeeze when they contract and force those chambers to empty. And the chambers being the two atria and the two ventricles that we'll talk about on the next page. Okay. There's also the layer, unfortunately, that can become damaged when a person has what's called a myocardial infarction, which is just best known as a heart attack. Okay. Now, the endocardium here is what this kind of purplish shaded membrane is showing you in our picture. Kind of shiny. Actually, it really is truly shiny. Wish we could be together and dissect a heart. We typically dissect sheep hearts, which are about the same size as ours, which pretty cool to see. But it's a interior lining of the heart, delicate layer resembling simple squamous. It covers the inner lining of the four vessels associated with the heart, the valves, and is continuous to the inner lining of blood vessels, where it's actually going to change name and become what's called the endothelium. Okay. As far as this picture, you can also see a couple things that we'll be talking about. Notice that the heart wall is not just straight; it's got kind of these jaggedy ridges. Those ridges are called trabeculae carneae. They're, you can see here, only found actually in the ventricles. We'll be talking about those. We'll talk about coronary blood vessels, coronary arteries, coronary veins that supply the heart with the nutrients that they need, and so on and so forth. This picture is just showing you kind of the situation that exists with the two layers of the serous pericardium, the parietal on the outside, the visceral on the inside, attached to the surface of the heart, and then the space in there between, which is full of that fluid that I just was talking about. All right, let's talk about the four chambers, each of which serves a specific purpose. There's two upper chambers, two lower chambers. The upper chambers are called atria, which is plural. Atrium is singular, so there's a right and a left atrium, and then there's two ventricles, singular form of that term, it's just ventricle. Okay. The atria are also known as receiving chambers because they're the ones that receive blood coming into the heart from outside of it. They receive blood from veins, and we can describe them as both being thin-walled and low-pressure systems. And they don't have a thick wall. Okay. They don't have to contract and force blood very far. The right atrium just pushes blood in the right ventricle, left atrium into the left ventricle. Okay. Let's talk about the right atrium first. Okay. Right atrium is the chamber received deoxygenated blood from our superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. Those are three veins that we'll talk a little bit more about here in just a second. Associated with both the atria is what's called an interatrial septum. Now, if you remember back, we've talked about this at several points in the semester. Inter means between, so the term interatrial means between atria, and septum is just a term that is, can be replaced with wall. This is a wall that separates the atria from one another, but especially when I talk about it with the right atrium, because in this right atrium associated with and facing the, or found on, I should say, the interatrial septum facing the right atrium is what's called the fossa ovalis, which is a remnant of what's called a foramen ovale, a hole that actually connects the right atrium to the left atrium in a fetal heart, but that typically closes soon after birth, and so you can just see the remnant of that. Okay. And I'm zooming ahead. Here's what it looks like. It's an oval hole, okay, why it's called a foramen ovale, but that essentially allows blood to skip from the right side of the heart directly into the left side of the heart. Okay. And the purpose of that is because one thing babies don't do before they're born is breathe on their own. Okay. The entire right side of the heart is dedicated to pumping blood to our lungs to pick up oxygen. Well, the lungs aren't picking up oxygen from the air because the baby's not breathing. Okay. They're getting their nutrients, their oxygen from mom. So there's really not an important reason to pump blood to the lungs. Okay, so there's actually two lung bypasses. This is one of them. Okay, but when we're born, we need our lungs to receive that blood, and as much of it as possible So that hole typically closes up shortly after birth, and therefore it becomes just what's called the fossa ovalis, just a little depression. And you sometimes hear about people, I've had students actually when I've been talking about this in class saying, actually, I have a hole in my heart. This is typically what they're talking about. And, you can live a fairly normal life. They might, get lightheaded or dizzy sometimes because their blood might not have as much oxygen as, a normal individual. They can be repaired surgically. Some people just, live their life without it, ever being fixed. So, okay, moving on. Associated with the right atrium is what's called the right auricle. If you think back to when we talked about the ears, the term for your external ear is your auricle. This is a appendage that looks like a little ear extending off of your right atrium. Basically, it just allows for a little extra blood flow to fill up the atrium, so it kind of balloons out, and which is pretty cool. Now, when our ventricles are not contracting, blood passes down through what's called the tricuspid or right atrioventricular valve from the right atrium into the right ventricle. We'll talk about the valves here in a couple slides. Left atrium, it receives oxygenated blood. So right atrium deoxygenated, left atrium oxygenated. This is blood that's gone to the lungs. We picked up that oxygen, we're bringing it back by what's called the pulmonary veins. About the same thickness as the right atrium, and when it contracts, it pushes blood through what's called a bicuspid, also known as mitral or left atrioventricular valve, into the left ventricle. Just like the right atrium, left atrium has a auricle. We call this the left auricle, accommodating extra blood flow. Okay. Both the atria have, if you open up the auricles, you can actually see what we call pectinate muscles. These are muscles on the anterior walls of both the atria and the auricles, and they just kind of help with contracting and forcing that blood down into the ventricles. Speaking of the ventricles, these are the lower chambers. We call them pumping chambers because they're the ones that push the blood out from our heart into arteries, into a large network of vessels. Okay, your right ventricle is what pumps blood to your pulmonary circulation. In other words, this is what goes to your lungs. Anytime you see pulmonary, refers to lungs. Okay. Talked about this on the first page, but this is what forms the anterior surface of our heart. It receives deoxygenated blood from the right atrium through that right atrioventricular valve, AV, short for atrioventricular. It is a relatively thin-walled, low-pressure system, although the right ventricle is much thicker than the right atrium. Okay, your left ventricle is the largest of all the chambers. We can describe it as the pumping chamber for our systemic circulation via a blood vessel known as your aorta. This is what pumps blood to the tips of your fingers, the tips of your toes, top of your head, places very, very far away from your heart. Okay? And it does so against, in some cases, high pressure, especially if you have high blood pressure. Your left ventricle has to be very strong. And, just like any other, skeletal muscle, the bigger it is, the stronger it is. The left ventricle is the biggest, therefore it's the strongest. About 4 times as thick as your right ventricle, and it is capable of creating much higher pressure than your left ventricle. Separating the two ventricles is what's called an interventricular septum. That's what this would be right here, the wall between left and right ventricles. And this is where you find part of what we call the cardiac conduction system, which is essentially the wiring of your heart. Talked about this on the previous page. Both ventricles have what's called trabeculae carneae. These are internal ridges that we find in both ventricles to increase pressure inside and thus help with ejection of the blood. Okay. Now, on the outside of your heart, you can see there are 3 grooves, or sulci as we call them. Sulci is plural, sulcus is singular. Okay. One that encircles it all the way around, and it's located between the 2 atria, the right and the left. They're the auricles of those 2 structures. It's a depression that circles all the way around between the atria, and we call this the coronary sulcus. Now, I actually have a cool little picture here that I can show. I can circle around. So looking at this, this is essentially the same view as what you're looking at here. The only difference is the heart's sitting straight up and down instead of at its corrected angle. And in our picture, we can see this would be the right auricle. Okay, notice there's this little depression right here, right there between the right auricle and this being the right ventricle. As I circle around, notice that that depression is there the whole time, all the way around, all the way down around to the left auricle and then back to where we started. And that's what we call the coronary sulcus. Okay. Coronary sulcus is the first. Then you've got two interventricular sulci, an anterior and a posterior. Okay. Anterior's on the anterior side, simple as that. Posterior's on the posterior side. Okay. They separate the ventricles. Once again, inter means between, so interventricular means between the ventricles. So this is depression between the two ventricles. One's on the anterior side, one's on the posterior side. Here's the anterior interventricular sulcus in our anterior view. Here's the posterior interventricular sulcus in the posterior view. Okay. You'd only be able to see those in the external view, which is not what we're showing here. This is a dissected cadaver heart. We've removed the front of the heart off, and so we can't see those because these are on the outside of the heart. Okay, we can also see in this picture and in the pictures on the next pages, several what we call great vessels that are associated with each side of the heart. These either bring blood away from the heart or bring blood to the heart or take blood away from the heart. Okay. Typically, arteries, think arteries away, and they typically, and I say typically, and I emphasize that term, carry oxygenated blood, blood that has plentiful amounts of oxygen away from the heart. Veins typically, emphasize the word typically again, bring deoxygenated blood back to the heart. But there are some exceptions to the rule, to those rules, and I will point those out here in a second, or as I go through. First two, superior and inferior vena cavas, are the two major blood vessels that are responsible for what we call venous return. Superior vena cava brings blood back to your right atrium from above the heart. Inferior vena cava brings it from below the heart. This inferior vena cava brings blood from everything below, and it starts, it's right about the level of your belly button, maybe a little bit lower, runs up, and then it dumps that blood right into your right atrium. Okay. The superior vena cava is much shorter, but still very important for venous return. Okay. On the back side of the heart is where you see the third blood vessel listed there, what we call the coronary sinus. It's located actually in that coronary sulcus. The coronary sulcus is depression where you find the sinus. Coronary sinus is the blood vessel. This is a blood vessel, what we call a vascular sinus. It's found on the posterior surface that also drains blood into the right atrium. So these first three are blood vessels that deliver blood directly into your right atrium, responsible for venous return. Okay. The next blood vessel, what we call a pulmonary trunk, is an artery that receives blood from the right ventricle and is the beginning of what we call the pulmonary arteries. Pulmonary arteries receive blood from the pulmonary trunk and take it to the pulmonary circulation. Okay. Along with the pulmonary trunk, they are the only arteries, and I would highlight this very important statement, in our body that carry deoxygenated blood. Okay. They ascend out of the right ventricle. Here's the pulmonary trunk. When the right ventricle contracts, it pushes blood up and out of the heart into the pulmonary trunk, like a trunk of a tree. It comes up, and then there's two forks. One that goes to your right lung. This would be the left, actually. The other one would be going to your right lung. Okay. This would be the left pulmonary artery, excuse me. This will be the right pulmonary artery over here, but we can't see it. And we can see them here in this picture. Pulmonary trunk, pulmonary artery here, pulmonary artery here. Now notice in this picture, the color of that set of blood vessels is the same color as what we showed here for the vena cavas. Okay. Typically, the color blue represents blood vessels that are veins. Okay. Red typically is used for arteries. And that's because blue represents deoxygenated blood. Red is associated with oxygenated blood. Okay. But these arteries, the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries are colored blue, and that's because they are, as I said, blood vessels that carry deoxygenated blood. They're the only ones that carry the blood to our lungs where the oxygen is then going to be picked up. Okay. After the blood runs through your lungs, we perform gas exchange in the pulmonary capillaries. CO2 is offloaded, meaning it's going to be exhaled out. We pick up oxygen that we breathe in, and that means we can bring the blood back to the heart, which is going to be done by way of the pulmonary veins. Okay. Pulmonary veins, and this is important, are the only veins that are found in our body that carry oxygenated blood, and that's why they are colored red. Okay. Their veins, instead of being colored blue, they're red, just like the pulmonary arteries were colored blue instead of being red. Okay, so it's a flip for the pulmonaries. Simple as that. Okay. Pulmonary arteries, or excuse me, pulmonary veins are the ones that bring blood back to what we call the left atrium. Okay. They do so after that blood has been oxygenated in our lungs. Okay. And then our last blood vessel is the aorta. This is the big dog. I always think of it like a garden hose, really big. It's the major artery from which all systemic arteries branch off of, either directly or indirectly. Okay, meaning any blood that goes to your feet, goes to your head, goes to your fingers, it travels via the aorta first. Okay. The aorta actually can be broken down into many different segments. It comes up and then it just loops right back down and goes down into our abdomen. Okay, so you'll see it listed as an ascending aorta, an arch of an aorta, a descending aorta, thoracic aorta, abdominal aorta. Those are just the same blood vessel. It just gives its name, or it's labeled based on where you find it. Okay. Here we can see descending, arch, ascending, descending. So typically, I focus on just knowing is the aorta, and at least for this lecture. We get into a little bit more in its parts in our next lecture when we talk more about blood vessels. Okay. Now, I talked about one of the two lung bypasses earlier associated with your right atrium and your left atrium. Okay. The second lung bypass is left over here as what's called a ligamentum arteriosum. Okay. You can see it right here in this cadaver picture. Okay. That is the remnant of what's called the ductus arteriosus, a blood vessel that during fetal life shunts blood directly from your pulmonary trunk into the aorta. So that blood that does make it down to the right ventricle and then is pumped out goes into the pulmonary trunk, and then some of that, not all of it, but a lot of it will end up going directly into the aorta, meaning that we completely skip the left side of the heart altogether. Now, some of that blood will make its way to the lungs and then back to the left side of the heart, but not all of it. Once we are born, it should close off, and that is going to be known as the ligamentum arteriosum from then on. And that's why it's shown here with white. This is basically just connective tissue or a scar type situation. Okay, try to point everything out that I was talking about here in this illustration. This is the anterior view. You can really see most of the major structures. Posterior view, you can see some of those other things that we couldn't see. Left atrium, right atrium, a little bit more visible. Once again, that's because the heart sits at that angle, pointing front to back. We get a little better view of things like the coronary sinus, posterior ventricular sulcus, so on and so forth. Now, what we'll look at here in our next page is an internal view where we can see some of those things, and this is of an anterior aspect of the heart where we can see the 4 valves. Okay, so let's get to that here in a second. All right, excuse me. In addition to cardiac muscle tissue, our heart wall also contains dense connective tissue forming the fibrous skeleton of the heart. There's 4 dense connective tissue rings that surround our heart valves. Since there are 4 heart valves, they fuse with one another and merge with that interventricular septum, which is the wall right here that we have mentioned a couple times now. In addition to forming a structural foundation for the heart valves, that fibrous skeleton prevents overstretching of those valves, serves as the point of insertion in bundles of cardiac muscle fibers, and acts as an electrical insulator between the atrium and the ventricles. As each chamber of our heart contracts, it pushes a volume of blood into the ventricles, or into a ventricle, or out of the heart into an artery. Valves open and close in response to pressure changes as the heart contracts and relaxes. And each of those 4 heart valves ensures that blood is only one directional, meaning that it won't allow what we call retrograde or backwards flow. Shouldn't allow blood to go backwards. Okay. Now there's 4 valves, and 2 belong to the class or category atrioventricular valves. 2 are semilunars. Atrioventricular valves are exactly, if you break down that word, exactly what it sounds like. Valves located between the atria and the ventricles. And one for the right side, one for the left side. They prevent blood from flowing back into the atria during ventricular contraction, or what we call systole. Okay. There's a right atrioventricular valve, or you can abbreviate that as a AV valve. And the other term to describe that is a tricuspid valve. There's also a left atrioventricular valve, also known as a bicuspid or mitral valve. So this one has 3 terms, this one has 2. Okay. Typically, I use the terms tricuspid and bicuspid. And those terms represent the number of little flaps or cusps that they have. A tri means 3, and there are 3 flaps forming that tricuspid valve. 2 forming the bicuspid valve. Okay, bi meaning 2. Okay, here we can see the real deal from a cadaver. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, bicuspid, tricuspid. Okay. Now, associated with these 2 valves that aren't associated with the semilunar valves are a couple structures. Okay. Connected to those are what we call chordae tendineae, which look like little strings or tendons. Okay, little cord-like tendons, and these are probably the coolest thing that you get to see when you dissect a heart. Unfortunately, you guys aren't going to get to do that, but they connect to the valve, and then on the floor of our ventricles are little muscles. They look like little fingers called papillary muscles. Those papillary muscles contract, and they prevent those valves from flipping inside out, which would cause blood to flow from the ventricles back into the atrium. Okay. So when the ventricles contract, papillary muscles also contract, vessels, or the valves, stay closed. And now, when those ventricles contract, they're going to cause the 2 semilunar valves to open up. Okay. Semilunar valves are the pulmonary and aortic valve, and that open up when the ventricles contract and close when the ventricles relax. There's a pulmonary valve located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and then between the left ventricle and the aorta is the aortic valve. Okay. Now, sometimes people can have heart valve damage. There's kind of 2 major types or situations with it. Stenosis is described as difficulty opening a valve. Insufficiency is described as inadequate closure of a valve. Okay. Typically, people have a little bit of both if they have a heart valve issue. Okay. Now, treatment can be, and it seems rather crazy, but they can go in and actually replace the heart. There's mechanical heart valves. They can also actually transplant one from, I think it's pigs that they use them from. It's kind of cool. I believe the most common issue is the aortic valve, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that. It's been a while since I've actually looked it up, but I was thinking that's what it was. So those are the valves. Here's, I love this image. You can see the internal features of the heart. Here's that right atrium. There's that fossa valgus I pointed out. Inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, right ventricle. You can see the right AV valve, tricuspid, right there, associated with the right ventricle. We also have things like the pulmonary valve, pulmonary trunk, so on and so forth. Left atrium, left ventricle, bicuspid valve, mitral valve, left AV valve, what do you want to call it? Chordae tendineae. Now they could be labeled over here, just like the papillary muscles could be labeled over here. They just, for whatever reason, chose to label them on this side of the page. The little ridges you can see on both sides, they could also be labeled over here, are the trabeculate carneae. You can see the difference in size between the left ventricle wall, the right ventricle wall, quite a bit wider, about 4 times as thick here than it is over here. So a lot of things visible here in this image. one you would definitely want to study if I were, you guys. Now, we have a good understanding of the structure of the heart and all the vessels and valves that are really closely associated with the heart. I want to talk about how you can actually trace a drop of blood in and out of the heart. So reading through, in postnatal or after birth circulation, our heart pumps blood into 2 closed circuits with each beat. The systemic circulation, which is what receives blood from your left side of the heart, okay, and then the pulmonary circulation, which is what receives blood from the right side of your heart. Okay. The blood that is pumped from the right ventricle is typically very dark red. It's deoxygenated blood, whereas the oxygenated blood is typically bright red, which is kind of cool. Okay, let's trace the flow of blood. Now, I've listed off here 10 steps. Notice here in our picture, there are 10 things labeled. Okay? Now, I would recommend you study these because this is something I will definitely ask you to know on the exam. I always tell students, you're not going to have to label the numbers or anything like that. So what I tell students to do is study it, feel like you know it, see if you can write these 10 steps out or as best you can on a piece of paper, without cheating. Okay? So begins with blood coming into the right atrium from things like your superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. And blood is then ejected from the right atrium into the right ventricle through the tricuspid or right atrioventricular valve. From there, blood is pumped from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk. Blood then travels by way of the pulmonary arteries to your lungs. Pulmonary capillaries receive that blood, gas exchange occurs. Now we've got oxygen in our blood, carbon dioxide has left the blood. Blood is now going to come back to the left side of our heart by way of the pulmonary veins. This blood is oxygenated, comes into the left atrium. Left atrium pushes the blood through the bicuspid, left atrioventricular valve or mitral valve, whatever you want to call it, all the same thing, into the left ventricle. Left ventricle then contracts, pushes blood through the aortic valve into the aorta to distribute blood to our systemic circulation. Okay. Blood then eventually goes out into your systemic capillaries for gas exchange. Now oxygen leaves the blood, CO2 is picked up. Then we come back to the heart, starting it all over. Blood comes in by way of the vena cavas and the coronary sinus. Okay. Now, it's pretty cool if you can actually do that. Okay, not only because you'll have to know it for your exam, but it's pretty cool to be able to do that off the top of your head. Okay, so learn it, and you'll have that ability to sound really smart next time you're around your family if you want. All right, let's talk coronary circulation. Okay, just like any other organ in your body, our heart is made up of cells that require oxygen and glucose and other nutrients, produce waste. Okay? The blood that's inside of your heart, inside the atria, inside the ventricle, is not going to be sufficient. It's not going to be there long enough for diffusion of those things to occur. Okay? That's because the blood's being constantly moved in and out, in and out. Okay? So what we need to do is actually deliver blood to the heart wall by way of its own set of blood vessels, what we call the coronary arteries, coronary capillaries, coronary veins. Okay? Mainly what we're talking about is feeding the myocardium, which should make sense. It's the thickest layer of the heart. It's that big layer of muscle. Okay? First blood vessel I want to talk about, the coronary arteries. These are the very first 2 branches coming off of the aorta. In fact, pretty much right when the aorta begins, branching off of it is a right and a left coronary artery. Okay? They supply the left and right sides of our heart respectively. Okay. Now, from there, and we'll talk more about these and look at these more in greater detail in our next lecture. You can see there are many branches of the right and left coronary artery. Okay. And it's important that blood is distributed throughout the entirety of the heart. Okay. And to help do so and to prevent like a heart attack from occurring, there are what we call anastomoses. Okay. Which connect branches of a given artery or extend between branches of different arteries. We'll talk more about anastomosis in the next lecture. So even if an artery is partially clogged or blocked off, we can still get blood to different parts of the heart at the same time. Okay? Because if we completely cut off blood flow through a coronary artery, that's what a heart attack is. Myocardial infarction is a fancy term for that. If it lasts more than a few minutes, death of the heart muscle will result, and that's not a good thing. And especially if it happens in this one, and that blood vessel is sometimes described as the widowmaker, or that heart attack associated with that is called the widowmaker. After blood passes through those arteries, it then flows into the coronary capillaries, where oxygen is delivered, nutrients as well, and we collect carbon dioxide and waste. From there, blood then is going to drain into the coronary veins. That deoxygenated blood will then collect into the coronary sinus, which is found on the backside of the heart, as we've talked about, and then enter into the right atrium. Okay. These illustrations I'm not really going to focus on too much, because in our next lecture we'll actually go and color them. These are actually pretty cool. Picture at the bottom, anterior view, posterior view over on the right, showing them what they've done is they've injected it with substance that can actually harden up, and they typically always inject red, once again for arteries, blue for veins, to denote oxygenated, deoxygenated blood. Okay, let's talk about just kind of the tissue and the makeup of our cardiac muscle. We're going to talk about some things that are unique, some things we actually have talked about before. Compared to skeletal muscle fibers, cardiac muscle fibers are shorter in length. They're less circular and transverse section, so if you cut them, they don't have that nice perfect shape to them. They're a little bit more oval shaped. But they're not long cylindrical structures like we saw with skeletal muscle. Instead, they can be short and have branches. Okay, and we can see that here's just a short unbranched one. Here we can see here's a branched one. There's another branched one. Okay, so that's pretty unique, giving them kind of a stair-step appearance. Okay, typically they're about 50 to 100 microns in length. Diameter is about 14 microns. Unlike skeletal muscle, which was multinucleated, there's only one centrally located nucleus typically, although some might occasionally have a second. And as I mentioned, they don't run the entire length of the muscle, so they're short, and they're connected to one another by thickened bands, what we call intercalated discs. These are irregular transverse thickenings of the sarcolemma. We've talked about this since that very first lecture on tissues back at the beginning of the semester. Now, these intercalated discs are very visible under a microscope, which you guys got to do or see in pictures. Okay? But these are home to kind of three things I want to talk about. Interdigitating folds are what these little finger-like extensions are that you can see here in this picture. Okay? You can see how there's kind of wavy borderline between the cells. It enables the cells to kind of lock in by way of these little finger-like extensions. Okay? It gives them a nice, strong connection. Okay? They're also going to have to help keep those cells locked in really nicely, kind of like welds, what we call desmosomes. Okay? Desmosomes are what these little white things are showing you. Those are just called cellular junctions or cell junctions, okay, that help hold those cells tightly together so they don't just separate from one another. Okay? That way, when the myocytes or muscle cells contract, they're not going to pull apart. Okay? Probably the coolest structures are these things called gap junctions. Okay? They're not going to help hold the cells together, but what they do is they connect cells electrically. Okay? And what that means is this cell can allow an action potential to spread to a neighboring cell. These are like little doorways for nerve signals to travel from cell to cell, which enables them to all become excited at the same time, which is super important because then they contract at the same time. And that's because, that's important because our heart has to contract in a very coordinated manner in order for it to work efficiently. Meaning, like, the atria have to contract, the ventricles have to be relaxed. Ventricles have to contract while the atria are relaxed. The ventricles contract at the same time, the atria contract at the same time. And we can't have different parts of the ventricles contracting because the blood's not going to be pumping in that coordinated manner that we've talked about. Okay. Other things, mitochondria, quite a bit larger, more numerous in cardiac muscle fibers than in skeletal muscle fibers, taking up about 25% of the cytosolic space in cardiac muscle fibers as compared to 2% in skeletal muscle fibers. We still see the same arrangement of sarcomeres, Z discs, A bands, I bands, all that wonderful stuff that we talked about. We can see that here at the bottom. It's not as many T-tubes. The SR, cycloplasmic reticulum, isn't as extensive, but for the most part, everything's still there that we learned about a few weeks ago before the world collapsed. So I'll just leave it at that. All right, last thing I want to talk about is the wiring of the heart. It's pretty cool. The heart has its own basically nerve signaling system, even though it's not truly a nerve signaling system. And that's because during fetal development, about 1% of the cardiac myocytes become autorhythmic, meaning that they can establish and depolarize, meaning they become excited at the same time, at regular time intervals. Okay? And so the action potentials, the nerve signals, actually originate in these cells instead of being originated outside the cells. Like when our skeletal muscles contract, they're stimulated by nerves. Okay? These cells constitute our cardiac conduction system, which controls the route and the timing of electrical conduction in our heart. It all begins with what we call the SA node, short for sinoatrial node, found up in our right atrium. And this is also known as our pacemaker. Okay? It's right under the epicardium, near that superior vena cava. And this is where the original signal to cause your atria and then eventually your ventricles to contract. Okay? When it depolarizes, it gets excited, signals travel like a wave, not only through the right atrium where it's at, but across and into the left atrium, causing what we call atrial systole, contraction of both the atria at the same time. Now, some of those signals, some of those nerve impulses travel to what we call the AV node. The AV node, short for atrioventricular node, okay, is the only place where those signals can travel, and connected to it is the AV bundle, or bundle of His, okay, which is the pathway for signals to leave the AV node. Okay. From there, the bundle then forks and travels down through our interventricular septum, as well as a right and left bundle branch. There bundle branches. They reach the apex of the heart and then travel up both sides of our heart through the ventricles by way of what we call Purkinje fibers. And that's what causes the ventricles to become excited and the ventricles to contract. Now, if you left your heart alone, okay, it would set a constant heart rate of about 100 beats a minute. Okay, our heart is never at a constant straight up beat per minute situation. It fluctuates second to second, minute to minute on a daily basis. Okay. And that's because although the signal originates in the SA node, it's influenced by signals from the sympathetic nervous system. That's what produces the fight or flight response. And when we release adrenaline, this thing fires more often. The signaling, the firing takes place here, but it can be modified how often it takes place. Okay. So hormones and signals from the autonomic nervous system can affect how often your heart beats, which is kind of cool. And it's something that we have to have done, and it's done, as we know, automatically for us. All right, guys, that's it.